Let's look at the post-Eurasian War Draka economy as depicted in S.M. Stirling's The Stone Dogs. In the aftermath of the Eurasian War, the world quickly divided into two competing power blocks: the domination of the Draka with Africa and Eurasia, and the Alliance for Democracy, which was essentially a greater United States of America with a constellation of vassal states making up the remainder. In the ensuing Cold War, technological advances took great strides forward, and the Draka, this society of warrior aristocrats, somehow managed to take over the entire solar system. So a really basic overview: the Draka economy has heavy agricultural roots. It grew into an industrial system. Its base unit of currency is the arak, a 1/10 ounce gold coin, which worked great for them until people started mining platinum group asteroids, at which point they switched to a commodities basket, which is not a new idea, but it's a good one. Never go full fiat. And of course, the obvious, the Draka economy is a slave-based economy. When you mention slave economy, most Americans think of this Django Unchained image, but in the American South there were slave craftsmen, slave stable masters. The Tredegar Iron Works that was building cannons for the Confederacy had slave workers and slave foremen overseeing them. Slaves operated distilleries. There was a much wider range of work. During the Second World War, both the Nazis and the Soviets made extensive use of slave labor in the production of war material, everything ranging from uniforms to the V-2 rocket. The first man-made object launched into space was built by slaves. A lot of the electronics we use on a daily basis rely on forced labor at some point in the supply chain, whether it's, Chinese camp inmates working factories or children forced to mine cobalt in the Congo. Industries from fishing to petroleum have hard labor with varying levels of coercion depending on where in the world you look. And that doesn't even touch on the global sex trafficking trade. In our world, this happens in the shadows. The Draka economy, and in fact their entire society, is based on it. The Draka use the term serf rather than slave, but in this case, it's a distinction without a difference. Look, you know how our economy's set up. Vaguely, feudal socialism, that's the official term, isn't it? Now, the feudal is obvious. Serfs work the land and all the wealth funnels up, leaving them in the dirt. But the socialism is equally important because the Draka economy is essentially collectivist. Draka industry isn't owned by wealthy industrialists or big corporations. Rather, it's organized into combines that work in the interests of the Draka state as a whole, and in fact are generally majority owned by the state. Draka citizens are also provided a stipend. It's a sort of universal basic income. So citizens all derive a share of the total wealth of the society, and land and resources are managed in a manner deemed to be in service of the collective good. Meanwhile, the serfs, being someone's property, are cared for and provided for at a level commensurate with their perceived worth. Everyone has food, everyone has shelter, and everyone has a job. And for most, that's all they have. This foundation creates a problem for the Draka as their economy becomes more dependent on complex technology. Field hands don't need to know how to read. Factory serfs can do without it. Even ordinary Janissary infantry soldiers could, though it's inefficient and we're giving them all basic now. Bookkeepers and secretaries and technicians, we could get away with rote learning, but times are changing. Computers and space between them, they're the frontier of power. Less than 100 million citizens in the Domination, 1.5 billion serfs. We need millions with real education. The end result here is tens of millions of serfs who are now literate and have advanced technical knowledge in various fields. It's important to note that not only do serfs do all of the drudge work, but most of the jobs that we would consider middle class are also done by serfs in the Draka system. In this context, being a serf in the industrialized post-Eurasian War Draka economy starts to be less like plantation slavery as we always think of it, and more like merely being a citizen of an authoritarian state. The closest analog we have to Draka Serfdom is slavery in the classical world or the Ottoman Empire. Draka serfdom is legally a rather severe form of chattel slavery, much like that of classical times, except that there is no manumission. However, there is slavery and slavery. Slave status is a different thing in a society where the institution is rare and marginal than in one where it is nearly universal. In the Domination, over 93% of the total population are serfs. Let's talk about janissaries. The term originates with the Ottoman Empire's slave infantry that was conscripted from Christian families under Ottoman rule. Young boys would be taken, educated, and trained as soldiers, and they were very good soldiers. It was a prestigious position, so much so that poor families would sometimes go to great lengths to see that their sons were recruited for the janissaries. But when you have a bunch of soldiers that live in their own separate social structures, permanently separate from the wider culture and society, they eventually become a problem. By the 19th century, the janissaries had become too powerful and rebelled, and they had to be smacked down with artillery. The Draka janissaries present a potentially much greater threat. They significantly outnumber the citizen military. They're also mechanized. While the Draka mitigate the risk by putting janissaries under citizen officers, vaguely reminiscent of what the British did with their colonial troops, the Draka face a constant struggle to balance the need for the janissary forces to be well-trained, well-organized, and as combat effective as possible, against the danger of that same force turning on the numerically inferior citizens. Even one unit of janissaries rebelling anywhere in the Domination could potentially spark a fatal revolt throughout. And this is their conundrum. Unlike other slaveholding societies, the Draka have excluded the most effective means of co-opting potential rebels amongst their serfs. There is no method by which a serf may become a citizen, and there is no way that a serf may buy their own freedom and leave. But at the same time, the Draka have to train hundreds of thousands of them to fight, give them weapons, and then send them off to be in contact with armies of free people under minimal supervision. They attach a lot of privilege to it, to the point that those who survive long enough in janissary service can be assured of old retainer status that will be able to retire with extremely light work and be provided for without contributing a whole lot. The Draka system, again, is in many ways less a slave society as we understand it and more a rigid caste system. There is mobility upward and down, with the exception that no serf can ever move upward into the citizen class, and no citizen, however useless, can be bumped down into serfdom. But what were these janissaries doing in India anyway? The Draka took India in 1976 because the opportunity presented itself, and world conquest is their national religion. But this creates problems. One does not simply annex India. New territory has to be secured, its resources developed, its population assimilated. Except in this case, the population is a resource. And the proportion of literate and educated in that population is well in excess of what the Draka require. In the Stone Dogs, this question is sidestepped, but presumably the surplus will be disposed of. Technocrats in our world long for a reduction of population. The Draka don't bother with white papers and speeches at Davos. If they have to turn 90% of India into a wildlife preserve and the rest into strip mines, they will do it without hesitation and regret nothing. The reason the Draka were able to seize the Indian subcontinent was because the country seceded from the Alliance for Democracy after discovering a nasty bit of interference by the OSS, which in their world never rebranded as the CIA after their Eurasian War, but is every bit as malicious and duplicitous and meddling as our own world's equivalent. There are no good guys in the Stone Dogs, only less bad guys. The Alliance for Democracy is an authoritarian and militarized superstate built on the idea of this inevitable war with the Draka, just as the Domination is motivated by the idea of their inevitable conquest of everything. The technological advances are driven by this rivalry. Everything is subordinated to this Cold War and the certainty that it will eventually go hot beyond their constant little border skirmishes. It's a mutually reinforcing proposition. Draka technological advance is initially driven by their circumstances as discussed in a previous video, and their rapid technological growth in turn drives the alliance to push technological boundaries. This is why the two powers have space battleships and mining stations in the outer planets during the 1970s. But ultimately, the trajectory of Draka society is towards stagnation. When they ultimately eliminate all outside rivals and have secure control over their serf population, they have zero incentive to change anything. Any change could be a potential disruption. The final society, they call it. Destroying the alliance isn't just a geopolitical goal. It's a core value. It's an existential need. Their industry and their economy are primarily in service to that end. The people of the alliance never really understand that on a gut level. Even after India, the elected leaders of the alliance waffle and prevaricate and try to make excuses to use half measures instead of recognizing the severity of the threat facing them.
No, of course not. Your project will finally give us the top hand, and we'll use it, never fear. Not in an all-out surprise attack, of course. That was 70s strategy. We'll demonstrate it. With the balls cut off their space defense capacity, they'll have no choice but effectively to surrender. With guarantees for the personal safety of their top people, of course. Ah, Lafarge glanced over at the other OSS officer. General Donati, is it just this suit, or are they all fucking insane out there on the West Coast?
This lack of fortitude is endemic in the Alliance, and it prompts elements of their deep state to hijack policy.
All the chairman and the president know is we're doing something, and the appropriations are in the Black Fund.
Life in the Alliance has been easy despite the threat hanging over them, and ease tends to breed weakness. In a more optimistic world, it would just lead to a cycle of bad policy and mild social unrest while priorities shuffled. But in their world, it leads to conquest, slavery, and for many a soul, death. The Draka had a goal and resolve. The Alliance did not. The Draka inherit the solar system while a few thousand Alliance survivors bugger off to Alpha Centauri, thus continuing the American tradition of fleeing tyranny into the wilderness in hopes of building a new life somewhere else. And at this point, the Draka economy begins a fundamental shift. Population stabilizes, institutions ossify. We'll talk about that bioengineering Homo dracensis thing later. But for now, we just need to recognize that the world that the Draka build is not a totalitarian, Sovietized hellscape. They have peace and social stability. No one ever goes hungry. They rewild much of the earth, filling these restored forests with animals, both natural and fantastical. They terraform Mars into a garden. Economic systems are never solely about economics. They all have ideological assumptions and social goals woven throughout them. In the case of the Draka economy, that goal was the conquest of anybody outside of themselves, the creation of their final society, which results in a rigid, biologically determined caste society. If we look at communist economies in our own history, they, on the surface, say that the goal is to eliminate wealth disparities. In practice, they concentrate power in the hands of a very small group of people. We should probably ask what ours is trying to do.